So far in our work on flooding, we've looked at two case studies and we've looked at the causes, the impacts and the responses to flooding. But what if we could just stop flooding altogether? Are there things that we can do that can reduce the risk of a flood event taking place? Well, luckily there are two things that people can do to manage the risk of flooding, so to make it less likely that floods happen. We can use hard engineering and soft engineering. Just take a couple of minutes to read through the information on the board that describes what hard engineering and soft engineering are. We're going to go through some examples of hard engineering now. The easiest way to think about hard engineering is that it's things that people build. Normally large concrete structures, but it doesn't have to be. One of the hard engineering strategies that people can use to reduce the risk of flooding is dams. Dams are often built along the course of the river in order to control the amount of discharge. Now, discharge is the volume of water within a river. So how do dams affect the river's discharge? Well, you build a large wall across the river valley, and the water is held back behind this wall. We call this wall a dam, and you can see in the top left, we've got our dam across the river valley. Water is held behind the wall in a lake that we call a reservoir. Lakes are made by nature, reservoirs are made by people. And water can be released from this reservoir in a controlled way downstream, so below the dam. And you can see that happening in the picture at the bottom left and in the picture on the top right. Take a minute to read through the information that's on the screen. Pause the video while you do that. We looked at this right at the start of our lesson on rivers. Dams can be used to produce electricity. So water flowing through the dam spins a wheel called a turbine, and that creates electricity. We call that form of electricity hydroelectric power. So not only do you reduce the risk of flooding, but you can also produce hydroelectric power. Another positive of a dam is that the reservoir encourages tourism. Tourists? Tell your screen what tourists are. Tourists are people that visit an area just for fun. And activities that you do just for fun we call recreation. So tourists are people that visit an area for recreation. And dams can be used for swimming and fishing and sailing, so they encourage tourism. People who live near dams will have lower costs for insurance. Tell your screen what insurance is. Insurance is where an individual or a business pays an insurance company monthly, so that when anything bad happens, such as flooding, the insurance company pays for the damage. People who live in very high-risk areas where there's a large chance of flooding pay higher insurance costs because the insurance companies don't want to pay for all the damage. So you pay them more monthly so that when the damage happens, they've got the money to do that. People that live in areas with a very low risk of flooding, where it doesn't flood very often, they pay lower insurance because it's less expensive for the insurance company to pay for the damage. So if you have a dam, that reduces the risk of flooding, so insurance costs for people are also reduced. However, dams are very controversial. Lots of people don't like dams. The reservoir behind the dam floods a large area of land. So it destroys habitats and farmland. And sometimes people have to move home because a reservoir has flooded their village. Also, as we briefly saw in Nigeria in 2012, so not in 2018 but in 2012, flooding was caused downstream because water from the dam was released too quickly. So if the water is let go too quick, that creates a large amount of water that rapidly goes downstream and can cause flooding. Dams can be very large, as you can see on the top right, or they can be relatively small. Either way, dams are quite an expensive way to deal with flooding. The massive concrete wall takes a long time to build and uses a lot of materials. Another method of hard engineering is embankments. Oh, we're going to do a quiz first, aren't we? Click on the quiz in the description below and complete section 1. Do not move on to section 2, just complete section 1. Leave the quiz open when you come back to the video. Pause the video while you do that. The second form of hard engineering is embankments. Embankments are raised walls built along the river banks. They allow the river to hold more discharge. Tell your screen what the discharge of a river is. The discharge of a river is the volume of water within the river channel. So if you build walls or embankments either side of the river channel, the river can hold more water. We talked briefly about this when we learnt about levees. Levees are natural features that are caused by flooding when the river deposits sediment on the river banks, and they increase the river's discharge. Embankments do the same thing, but embankments are made by people. Pause the video and read through the positive and negatives of embankments shown on the screen. Embankments are easier to build than dams, and therefore they're less expensive, so they're cheaper. They also lower the insurance costs to residents. Anything that reduces the risk of flooding will lower insurance costs. However, compared to soft engineering strategies, they are still expensive. One of the major problems with dams is if floodwater builds up behind... one of the major problems with embankments is if floodwater builds up behind the embankments, you've got a large amount of water that's now being held in the river channel. Because remember, the embankments allow the river to hold more discharge. So if the embankment then fails and breaks, all that water is going to flood into the surrounding area. And you can see that on the picture in the right. If that embankment breaks, all those houses behind it are going to be affected. And because embankments let the river hold more water, if they do break, then the flooding is worse. And also, once the water has gone over the embankment, it makes it very difficult for it to flow back into the river because the embankment is in the way. Complete section 2 of the quiz now. Pause the video while you do that. Leave the quiz open when you return to the video. Now we're going to talk about soft engineering strategies. These are strategies that reduce the risk of flooding but try to work with natural river systems, so things that the river would do normally. One soft engineering strategy is afforestation. Afforestation is when trees are planted near the river. This increases the amount of interception of rainwater and therefore decreases the amount of surface runoff, reducing the discharge of the river. Okay, there are a lot of big words in that one. What's interception? Tell your screen what interception is. Interception is when vegetation, like trees, traps rainwater. If there is more interception, there's going to be less water flowing over the ground. What is the key term we use to describe water flowing over the ground? Tell your screen. Well done if you said surface runoff. So if there's more interception, there's less surface runoff. So there's less water flowing into the river, which means that the volume of water in the river, or the discharge, will be lower. Read through the positives and the negatives of afforestation on the screen. Pause the video while you do that. One of the things that is really good about afforestation is that it is cheap. And it also creates new habitat, so it makes the environmental quality of the drainage basin or the river valley where they're planting the trees better. However, it does take a long time for the trees to grow. So you don't instantly reduce the likelihood of flooding. It takes several years before they start working. It's also not as effective as building a dam. Water is still going to reach the river, and you're not controlling the amount of water in the river as much as you would if you built a dam or embankments. So it doesn't prevent flooding entirely, it just reduces the severity. Severity means how bad it is. So it makes the flooding less damaging or less severe, rather than stopping flooding entirely. Another strategy that we can use is a flood warning system. A flood warning system is when people are told about the possible risk of flooding through TV, radio, and newspapers or the internet. So we can predict the weather. We know when there's going to be large amounts of rainfall. And we can tell people through either loudspeaker systems or just on the internet that the risk of flooding is going to be likely. We saw that in the Somerset levels when the Met Office issued an amber warning. Read through the positives and negatives of flood warning systems. Pause the video while you do that. So if people have warning about the flood, they can prepare for it. They can put sandbags up around their houses like the people in Somerset did. And that will prevent some of the water flowing into the houses. They can also evacuate and move to a safe area. They might move their belongings or possessions, which are things that they own, upstairs so they don't get damaged. But it doesn't stop the flooding at all. So you're still going to get some damage, you're still going to get flooding, it's just going to be less damage than if people didn't have warnings. Also, some people might not receive the warnings. So some warning systems are better than others. If you have lots of different ways of giving out the warning, people are more likely to hear the warning. Like if you have a loudspeaker system. However, if you just use one way of giving out a warning, people might not hear it, they might not get the warning, and therefore it becomes totally useless. Complete the quiz, section 3. And that will be the end of today's video.